Marc Blitzstein's never-produced choral opera, The Condemned, inspired by the SACCO Vanzetti case, was completed 80 years ago in 1932. That work, among others, would be drawn upon through the years by him and later by me. In 1959, the work he would call his magnum opus, the opera SACCO and Vanzetti, was commissioned by the Ford Foundation, optioned by the Metropolitan Opera, but left unfinished at his death in January 1964. Its structure only became clear when I discovered that he had written an outline for the 3 acts in the appendix of his copy of The Untried Case. This is a book by Herbert Ehrman, which his sister Jo Davis had given him. This is not his copy. This is my copy, which I actually got from Community Church. But in the back of his copy, he wrote in the appendix, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. You can see it there. The theater presser libretto prints that, so you can see the structure, which no one quite knew what he wanted to do until I found that in the archives in Madison, Wisconsin. For this production, director Ben Spierman and I decided to divide the work into 2 parts rather than the original 3 acts, the way quite a few 3-act operas are presented, with only 1 intermission, including Berg's Wozzeck, Blitzstein's Regina, My Hannah, and Gilbert and Sullivan's Princess Ida, which I'm going to be conducting on Long Island next spring. We have at least 1 or 2 members of that cast with us today. We'll have a break after the 8th of the 15 scenes. And here's what happens in those first 8 scenes. I'm going to summarize the second part after intermission. In scene 1, the chorus tells what will be shown. This is the end of the opera. After this, it begins. In scene 2, at the Sacco family home in Stoughton, Massachusetts, May 5th, 1920, Nicola and his wife Rosa are entertaining their son Dante, rehearsing a melodramatic scene from Ibsen's Dollhouse in Italian, intending to perform it for a strike benefit. Bartolomeo Vanzetti enters, just back from New York, bringing with him Mike Boda and Riccardo Orciani. Their friend Andrea Salcedo jumped or was pushed from the 14th floor after a brutal police investigation. Fearing they may be next, the men leave to get Boda's car to collect and then hide anarchist literature they fear may be incriminating. This is the time of the Red Scare and the Palmer raids, during which hundreds of aliens, including Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, were rounded up and deported. Scene 3 takes place at the Elm Square Garage in West Bridgewater later that evening, May 5th, 1920. Boda and Orciani arrive by motorcycle. The owners, Ruth and Simon Johnson, find their Italian accents suspicious. She calls the police. Boda and Orciani leave quickly. Sacco and Vanzetti arrive by streetcar and are arrested. The Johnsons demand a reward. Now, this was the scene that my teacher, Bob Palmer, played 4 hands with Blitzstein in Rome in 1963 and with me here in Valley Stream in 1999. He then wrote the Blitzstein estate, urging them to commission my completion, which I dedicated to him. And we're very pleased to have his daughter and son-in-law with us today. After a brief interlude, scene 4 takes place at the police office in Brockton the next afternoon. Chief of Police Michael Stewart and District Attorney Frederick Katzman interrogate Sacco and Vanzetti and bring in a slew of witnesses, including Mary Splain and Michael Levangi, to try to identify them. In a monologue, Katzman readily admits to being ambitious, concentrating on what he perceives to be the defendant's consciousness of guilt. Police Chief Stewart, incidentally, was still alive when Blitzstein was writing the opera and objected to being portrayed in it. So Mark thought he'd make this a choral scene, as in The Condemned, but with Stewart's death, objections disappeared. I put him back in the opera. Scene 5, Sacco and Vanzetti are visited 2 days later in Brockton Prison by Attorney John W. McInerney and wealthy dowager Mrs. Elizabeth Glendower Evans. The defendants believe they were arrested because they are anarchists, but they learn the actual charges are robbery and murder, of which they maintain and convince their visitors they are innocent. McInerney agrees to persuade his brothers, also lawyers, to take the case. Mrs. Evans will help pay for the defense. Scene 6 takes place a year later, May 30th, 1921, a Memorial Day parade extolling loyalty. The music is derived from Blitzstein's 1934 setting of Alfred Hayes' poem, Into the Streets, May 1st. In scene 7, at Dedham Courthouse the next day, a jury is selected and opening arguments are made before Judge Webster Thayer. California attorney Fred Moore, wearing sandals, alienating the judge, leads the defense. From a list of alibi witnesses, the jury notes they are all Italians. Will the defendants testify on their own behalf? In scene 8, Sacco and Vanzetti are in separate cells. Vanzetti describes his routine with cheerful irony. Mrs. Evans tries to cheer up Sacco. Rosa comes to visit her husband along with their son Dante briefly. She and both defendants long to return, at least for a visit, to their hometowns in Italy, Torre Maggiore and Villa Falletto. The music is based on Blitzstein's song from Reuben, The Hills of Amalfi. And now, part one of Sacco and Vanzetti in its staged orchestral premiere.